Now, the second part of this chapter 6 deals with population. And the person that most typifies the discussion of population is Robert Malthus, or to be more formal, Thomas Robert Malthus. Now, a lot of people, before Malthus, so just like I've done in the other slides, let me just talk a bit about Malthus as a person before we start getting into the slides. People in England at around this time, this would be early 19th century, so let's say around the year 1800. In 1801, we had the very first census held in Britain, in England. And so that represented the first formal time that we actually counted up how many people existed. There's always this kind of stress, I guess, around counting the number of people. Because even with that very first census in 1801, people felt like it invaded their liberty, I guess, to exist without being counted. So even back then, a census was kind of controversial. But what the British saw around them was they, especially in England, they had all of these people, but Britain is an island. So they had these limited resources, and they kept seeing all of these people. And the issue was, are we getting even more and more people, or is the population size starting to decline? About 100 years prior to that first census, one person thought, Gregory King, he was this guy that was pretty famous for making maps in England. He had looked at baptismal registers, meaning that how many people were getting baptized in the country. And he also looked at something called hearth taxes, which was basically how many households did we have, and basically the taxes that people pay. So by looking at hearth taxes and baptismal registers, Gregory King, this maker of maps, in 1696, he had estimated that there was about 5.5 million people, which turned out to actually be pretty close to the number that we think actually existed. But King had thought that 5.5 million people that existed in 1696 wasn't going to grow that quickly. His estimate was that by the year 2300, we'd have about double the number of people. So about 11 million people, and that it would take until about the year 3500 or 3600 to double that number, to get 22 million people. Which, again, was, the best estimate that map maker could make. Adam Smith, which again is our focus of chapter 5, he comes onto the scene, and what Smith saw was this idea that it wasn't the case that population was going to grow slowly. Rather, Smith and others thought that the population was going to decline, and that population decline was coming from the fact that people, because we had this free market economy, that people, didn't have to perhaps work as hard. They didn't have to have a lot of kids to get a lot of money if they were going to get some of these gains, if they were going to start to get some of these gains from the division of labor. Malthus. Thomas R. Malthus is a person who, in 1798, writes a book called The Essay on the Principle of Population as it Affects the Future Improvement of Society. And what that book in 1798, so remember at this point, Bentham's text comes out in 1789. Malthus's text comes out in 1798. So now we've got kind of a text 20 years out from Wealth of Nations from Adam Smith. And what Malthus says is quite different from Smith and from Bentham, in that Malthus is quite pessimistic. You know, the general idea we get from Adam Smith and even from Bentham is that we're on this path to progress and prosperity, that we're going to get order in society. First, if you're Bentham, from getting this idea of utilitarianism being followed, and if you're Adam Smith, you're going to get order in society from a well-functioning market that promotes free trade. What Malthus says is that basically the population, because of that we're going to have a population problem, and what this population problem is going to cause is it's going to cause people to live a meager, dreary, and chilling life. And that what he thought was that population has just a tendency to grow until people outstrip the ability of the resources to feed and clothe them. Meaning that people are always going to, I don't know how to put this nicely here, so that basically people are going to have, you know, a lot of sex, and they're going to reproduce a lot. They're going to have a lot of kids, and nothing's going to stop them from their desire to want to have sex, with the consequence of that being that, you know, every month is going to be like Russian roulette. They might have a kid that month or not, right? 9 months later, right? Because you're just doing it all the time. And because of that, because we can't, I don't know how else to say it here, but because we can't control that urge to do it, then basically people will keep having more and more kids, and there's nothing that curbs that urge that would stop them from having so many kids. So many kids that nature, you know, and the resources that come from it can't give us enough food to feed all the kids that we're creating. It's what Malthus is the one we have to blame for why economics is sometimes called a dismal science, because it was, you know, it's a pretty horrible conclusion that you'd want to draw about the nature of society. Malthus, like Bentham, was focused on this idea of, like, what does economics exist? Why does it exist? You know, for Bentham, the idea was that you could create good, sound economic policy by following this philosophy of utilitarianism. For Malthus thought that population, this notion of population and its tendency to grow too much could actually have some consequences for just the nature of economic theory. It was a really popular book. His essay on population, between its initial publication in 1798, over the next 30 years, it went through 6 editions. And in these 6 editions, I mean, people just really took a strong liking or a strong believability to that idea that population essentially grows geometrically, meaning, right, two people have three kids. Those three kids then each have two kids, right? Then, all of those kids, those six kids each have two kids, right? So it's growing geometrically. And that even though the population is growing geometrically, that the food supply and other resources are not growing that quickly. So population growth is essentially outstripping food supply. And that you're going to get economic distress, economic disorder, unless you find a way to make sure that the population grows in a more limited fashion that matches the ability of the resources to feed them. What would that check be? What would that limit on population be? For Malthus, it's this idea of misery and vice. What you would basically do, right, is you'd want to have some way for people to be restrained from continuing to make lots of kids. Or what you would want to do is you would want to make it so that, right, what do people do back in the 1800s? They have lots of kids because they don't know how many kids are going to survive past their first birthday or second birthday because of poor health care. So what you could try to do is you could try to think about population changes more thoughtfully. You could try to talk about the value, for instance, of preventative care, right? That might stop people from dying of diseases that are easily preventable. And that, in turn, might stop people from having so many kids, right? You could also talk about the death rate. You could start to do policies that control the death rate, right? Make it so that people don't die unexpectedly, even later in life. Still, despite doing those things and having this notion of virtue and vice trying to control society, Malthus did still feel this kind of, I don't know what to call it here, but he just felt that, again, there's not too many lectures in my life in economics where I get to say this word, so I guess, or these words, so I say it both uncomfortably, but also just know this is not going to be the rhyme or reason of this entire course. But just to put it out there truthfully, that Malthus just believes that the strong desire of sexual passion between people is going to create too much population and create subsistence level of existence, especially among the working classes. Again, it's a little bit judgmental here, but what you basically see today is that, and that rich people, I guess, back in this day, don't have as many kids, and that poor people are bored and they're not watching TV, I guess. Well, I guess not in this day they're not. But, right, poor people don't have anything better to do, so all they do is they just have sex and have more kids. Yeah, so that gives us at least now kind of an introduction to the rest of these slides here. Okay, so again, he lives from about 1766 to 1834. His father, David Malthus, his middle name, what Daniel, was a member of the landed class, and what this did for Malthus is that it really did shape Malthus's view of the differences between rich people and poor people. It made it so that his father and him would have these debates, and while his father Daniel might have thought that the landed class got all their benefits just because they were smarter and better people. Malthus, at least in our case here, the son, could look at this at least and say, well, it's not necessarily that. Rather, it's that those who are rich do a better job at controlling their passion, I guess, having less kids and being able to focus kind of their resources on capturing more and more wealth. Malthus works closely with Hume, with Rousseau, Condorcet, Godwin, and these are all both French and English economists at the time that were quite influential. Much in the same of Adam Smith. So where Smith goes to University of Glasgow and then starts working on his Wealth of Nations text, Malthus gets a degree from Cambridge and then starts working on his essay of population, and the essay eventually turning into the book in 1803, about 25 years after Adam Smith's work. Yeah, it has a long book title. I only write it here because how times change, right? No one's going to read a book title that is that long anymore. And so I guess there's some beauty to the fact that people used to read much longer things. But it does, in some sense, this book title does capture the essence of what Malthus was trying to talk about. In his case, right, unlike Bentham, who's trying to talk about how do you make society better with good laws and good legislation, Malthus is talking about how do we make society better by just having a more thoughtful conversation about the growth of the population. And again, trying to create some controls on that population so that we can, so that people don't unduly suffer. Again, much as I've spoken about before here, but this gets us at least to talk about it a little bit more formally through the slides, is that, again, England was facing a lot of pressure here. As an island, it was basically, it had a lot of people and not enough, the thought was not enough land and food supply to be able to support all the people that it had. And the reality was that we were seeing is that England was starting to have to import food to be able to feed itself. So it was no longer self-sufficient, which again is a break from these kinds of mercantilist beliefs, which are still kind of out there, even after Adam Smith. These mercantilist beliefs are still out there. And also, though, too, Malthus is looking around him in England at this time and just seeing utter abject poverty among the working class, and that they have, let's say, 6 or 7 kids. And you have to ask yourself, what is creating that poverty? So what does he do? He debates with his father, as he's leading up to the creation of this text. He's talking about it with his father. These authors that were becoming a little bit, that were becoming a bit more popular, and that would be Godwin and Condorcet. And so what Godwin and Condorcet, as Malthus is talking about their essays with his father, what he's getting is 2 key beliefs. Is first, from Condorcet, you're more so Condorcet. Condorcet is basically saying that you can make people better, that human nature is perfectible if you get the proper institutions to support them. Right? So society can be better if they're surrounded with good institutions. And then a bit more from Godwin, what you're getting is this belief that we should redistribute income again from the wealthy to the poor. So Godwin and Condorcet are, that sounds optimistic, right? And so the younger of the Malthus, the primary Malthus here that we're talking about here, from Malthus, that's too optimistic, and Malthus, again, as we kind of talk about here in number 4, Malthus looks, across the English Channel and sees that in France you've got this French Revolution, 1789. And people overtake they depose the King of France, as they start to build a republic. And you've got individuals like Robespierre in this kind of reign of terror. And people aren't happy with this effort to kind of remake society into something else. And Malthus is part of that idea that, we just need to take a step back before we just start destroying everything. We need to take a step back and think what got us to this point where we felt that things had to be destroyed. Maybe it doesn't have to be that extreme. And so he starts out by writing an essay. So before the book, there is the essay. And the essay, which gets us this principal population, just again makes those 2 assumptions, which I don't think it's too hard to find a great deal of agreement with these assumptions. You need food to live, and people like having sex with each other. I don't know why he's saying it. I could not teach human development. I could not teach. I guess this is where being Catholic is my undoing here. Having to talk about this is a little uncomfortable for me. So at least let's just move on with this here. People need to eat, and people do it with each other, and most of the time they make kids. So if these are the 2 beliefs here, you need food to live, people do it with each other and end up making kids. One is growing geometrically, that would be the population, but that the food is only growing arithmetically. Geometrically means basically at a faster pace, right? So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, right? If you get this kind of doubling. And right, we looked at that doubling remember again with 1696 with King looking at those maps and saying that the doubling wasn't happening that quickly. Malthus is saying, no, dude, it is growing much faster than what King had predicted in 1696. And even if it's not growing as fast as Malthus thought it was, he could still say, dude, it doesn't matter. Eventually, the population will double. And when it does, we're still going to have a problem because the food is only going to grow arithmetically. Incremental increases, which are not going to be enough to feed the population. And what that gives us here is this idea that you would need to find ways to control the population. And you could do that either with positive checks or with preventative checks. The positive checks, again, where we're talking about things like the death rate, that would be things like famine, plague, and war causing these huge unexpected decreases in the population. Or, again, you could create preventative checks. You could try to create a society that causes people to wait to get married, not get married, or to not have kids. What's is a sort of an aside to this, right? And when we just think about economic history of economic thought, we just think, oh, it's just old dead guys, and we're just in this course just talking about old dead guys. I mean, think about this. This is a fundamental part of the debate in today's society. You know, everyone is talking about how rich, developed countries, how the fertility rate has fallen dramatically. In Korea, for instance, Korean women, I think the fertility rate is like 0.7 or something like that, 0.6, 0.7. That basically companies that used to make strollers have had to turn to start to make dog strollers. I don't know, it's like this thing where people put their dog in a stroller and then walk their dog in the stroller. That in the United States, the only way the United States is able to grow is largely through immigration. I don't know, not enough sightings in the world, I guess. I mean, dude, I've done my part. I've had 3 kids, and I don't know. All I can do is point fingers at other. Maybe to start doing it more. I don't know. As opposed to, right, and then I look at government policy. The government is, if anything, encouraging me to have more kids, right? I mean, I get a lot of money for having a lot of kids, right? In the form of child tax credits, a larger family, which means that my deductions go up more. What Malthus thought was that the preventative checks weren't going to be that useful. That it was going to be really hard to have sustainably enforceable rules against marriage or people doing it. Because he just thought that the working class was incapable of refraining from doing it. And he also felt that if you stop people from getting married, then it's just going to cause people to do it before they get married, which is just going to cause all this social disorder of people having children out of wedlock. So that basically then means that the only way you can control the population is with famine, plague, and war. Dude, that's pretty dismal discussion. Which then basically means that you don't want utopia. You don't want things to be good. Because if things are good, as they might be under Godwin and Condorcet, if things are good, then the population will even grow more. And even if things like, under Adam Smith, we get rid of these mercantilist policies, we start having markets, and these markets lead to people having more income, then what do people do when they feel a little richer? I don't know, they do it more. So with more income, the working class simply are just going to have more children, which is what we don't want, right? At least if you're Malthus, which is what he doesn't want to have happen. And it means that society is going to just keep growing and growing and growing, outstripping the resources, and it's going to cause this starvation and misery. And for Malthus, unlike the French Revolution, where the idea was that we could just restructure society's institutions and get a better world, Malthus doesn't think that. There's going to be no way to restructure society's institutions to make it so that the working class isn't miserable and starving. They're going to starve because they keep doing it. So these, again, are just some sample quotes, again, because I'm presuming most of you aren't going out on your own and reading the original text. So these are just some things, you know, again, as I was kind of preparing for this lecture and thinking about things here. So here we've got, it has appeared from the inevitable laws of nature, some human beings must suffer from want. These are unhappy people, unhappy persons who in the great lottery of life have drawn a blank. So basically, the poor are just unlucky people who have ended up that way. And then we get to the second quote, which is basically, you could try to create a society where you just then redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor. But Malthus says to that, there's no possible sacrifices of the rich, particularly in money, which could for any time prevent the recurrence of distress among the lower members of society. So basically, no matter how you redistribute the wealth to the poor will always be poor. And the reason why the poor will always be poor comes from our third quote. The reason why the poor will always be poor is because basically they keep doing it. The superior power of population cannot be checked without reproducing misery or vice. The ample portion of these two bitter ingredients in the cup of human life and the continuance of the physical causes that seem to have produced them bear too convincing a testimony. So basically, people are just going to do it. If they get more income that they got from the rich, then they'll just do it even more and have even more kids. And so what he says is, again, part of this positive checks to how do you control society here. That positive check being that famine seems to be the last, most dreadful resource of nature. The power of population is so superior to the power of earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape visit the human race. Basically, people have to die, right? From war, from epidemics, from plagues, from war, all of these things. And that basically what it does is that as the population falls, then we can start to be able to feed the people that we have, the fewer people that we have. Again, this is what gets us economics to be called this dismal science, because Thomas Carlyle, someone in the 1800s who just kind of commented on things, read the work of Malthus and just said, geez, what a depressing guy. This guy is dismal. So the dismal science. What he believes, what Malthus believes then should exist for society, is that you shouldn't have these poor laws. You shouldn't try to help the poor, because all you're doing is giving them more income and you're just going to have more kids. So he's opposed to the Speenham Land Law of 1795, which basically was kind of your minimum income for all the poor, right? And we see that, right? We see that kind of guaranteed salary kinds of schemes, plans being circulated today. And then Malthus is also against the Poor Law Amendment of 1834, which basically said that if you were capable of working, then you shouldn't be getting any help, other help. We see that today, right? We see today this idea that, in some states, you can't get certain forms of relief, like, for instance, food stamps, unless you're disabled. If you're capable of working, then it can be pretty difficult to get food stamps in some states. I guess that would be kind of a Malthusian relic. Now, it turns out that all of Malthus's dismal predictions don't come true. And part of the reason for that is, Malthus he was just too much of a classist. He felt that the working class were just morally vanquished, and that they didn't have any moral principles. But they do. And I don't want to get into methods of contraception here, but even back in this day, right, 1800s, there are forms of contraception, which would mean that you could still do the act, and you could at least reduce the chances of having a kid. right? Because no contraception is going to be perfect, but you can certainly reduce it with even methods that existed back then. And let's just jump to the fourth bullet point, and then I'll go back to the third. And then also, right, you also have this idea where you don't want to confuse your desire to do it, to have sex with another person, with your desire to have children. Now, for someone like myself, is a little, from someone like myself, and for those who perhaps are a bit more religious, sometimes that might be a little bit hard to distinguish the two. And that might have been Malthus's problem as well. I actually don't know how religious Malthus was. But my guess would be, if I had to make a guess, he must have been pretty religious, because in many religions you don't distinguish between the two. Because really, in most religions, the reason why you conflate, you consider the same sexual instinct with the desire to have children. I mean, that would be the reason why you do it, is because you want to have kids. The notion of why would you do it if you weren't going to have kids can seem confusing, for instance, to someone who's Catholic. But dude, not everyone is that religious, right? And many couples have, even today, right, have those conversations where they can be doing it for a long time, and then they finally have a conversation: should we try to have a kid? I mean, again, a Catholic might not understand that kind of notion, but other religions, or just even people who are non-religious, there is a distinction between the two. Probably the biggest thing was that food supply also doesn't just grow arithmetically. It can perhaps grow geometrically. How? Because of the Adam Smith notion of division of labor. Because of innovations that were made in the notion of how do you just grow food, which would be things like having a field be fallow for a season, for instance, to kind of regenerate it, by finding ways to just make the land more productive. And then you get things even later, like barbed wire fences, tractors, and whatnot throughout the 19th century and 20th century that leads to more food being able to be grown. So, what Malthus then does from his incredibly popular, what he does from this popular population theory is in 1820 he writes Principles of Political Economy. And in Principles of Political Economy, what he does is he develops one of the first theories we have for the business cycles, which economists are going to work on for about 110 years later. They're going to work through this theory for 110 years, all the way until Keynes. Keynes gives us kind of the modern day theory of business cycles. Malthus is the first, though. So Malthus felt that we get these market gluts due to this lack of demand, this insufficiency of effective demand in the economy. And that it happens, these market gluts, or what we would call today a recession, that these recessions occur because these workers are receiving a subsistence wage. So basically, because the workers don't have enough money to purchase all that they are producing, then the problem is that they're producing more when they go to work, but then they can't take the wages that they get for work, and they can't buy enough. So basically the workers are producing more than what they're capable of purchasing. They're more productive than their compensation would allow them to be. And what tends to happen here in these kinds of societies is that in the Malthusian world, these profits that are generated, capitalists take these and they accumulate them, and they accumulate this capital. They take it and and they produce these goods, but then it turns out that the people don't buy enough of it. But then if the capitalist knows that not enough people are going to be buying the things, then it's going to reduce future profits, right? Because people are going to know, I'm not going to sell everything I'm producing. And so now we can start to see for Malthus this idea of a market system starting to collapse, because everyone knows it's not going to end well, that the accumulation of wealth is going to go as profit levels go. And so what we need to have happen here is we need the rich people to intervene. We need rich people to go in and buy the stuff that's left over, the shortfall that's in aggregate demand, the fact that people aren't buying enough. And only then can capitalists continue to earn the profit levels that they've got, and can continue to accumulate wealth. Malthus gets us what we see today, especially, well, you would see it even in intermediate micro and especially in intermediate macro. You would see these notions of what does it mean? What does rents mean? Rent for the landed class, for those who are rich, is not a cost of production. Rather, it is this surplus. It's a surplus that's the difference between the price of the agricultural goods and the cost of production. Essentially what it is it's coming from the land, from the resources, essentially from nature. It's adding to demand without adding to the cost of production. And so what this leads to Malthus doing, when we get to talking a little bit more about what does this mean for society, is that we start to get then again these corn laws. And these corn laws are going to work to restrict the importation of corn from Europe. And what it does is it's going to make England have to try to produce more corn, which is going to be important for Malthus because that's going to be the way that we avoid a recession in the English economy, because it's going to keep the profit levels higher. It's going to keep the rents higher. And what you would want to have is now look at this, it's an early Keynesian idea, that you would have the government intervene to try to remove a recession by basically making up some of that demand that is insufficient. For instance, engaging in a war, like we did, for instance, with World War II, or the government spending on public works, right, which we did with like the WPA and the NRA during the 1930s. And all of that is just a precursor to Keynes. What is really cool, especially that you're seeing here at the end of this slide, is that it really, we saw it with Smith, we saw it with Bentham, we're seeing it with Malthus, is that this is kind of emphasizing how economics is a science in the sense that it is that people are building off of the ideas of others. Keynes is just building off of Malthus, making some variations, but building off of this, building off of it. Bentham, building off of, Bentham and Malthus, building off of Smith. Smith, building off of the physiocrats. The physiocrats, building off of the mercantilists. The mercantilists, building off of the Greeks. Right? It's all building on top of each other here. And what we get then with Malthus then is the start of the lead-in to starting to talk about money. And you get that by starting to talk about, so this would be the third part of chapter 6, of starting to talk about value. So for Malthus, that value is being determined by the wages plus the profits. And that the price itself is determined by this, by the demand and supply conditions in the economy. So it's not that utility is determining the price, rather it's demand and supply. And what we see as well is that the idea that for Malthus, these classes are, they shouldn't be seen as different from one another. In fact, Malthus didn't really see any inherent conflict between workers and the landed class, as long as the market was working properly and we can kind of smooth out these business cycles, right? Because then the capitalists will continue to invest in the economy, continue production, which is going to continue to give wages to the workers. And really, for Malthus, the most important thing to keeping this all going is that you need, again, to have these rents. And so where we conclude with this, at least for Malthus, is that people, at the end, at least if you adopt this belief that people are going to get stuck with these subsistence wages, then subsistence wages will in some sense control the population growth. And if the economy grows too quickly, then wages will grow. And if wages grow, then people have more people, which would then lead to a decrease in living standards. So the only way you can change things is if you grow the entire economy. And that's where we get with the last sub-bullet point here, that the subsistence wage can change as the living standards change, and that the living standards can change as the economy grow. What it means to be poor in America is different what it means to be poor in, for instance, India or sub-Saharan Africa, right? But what it means to be poor today in the United States is different than how it used to be poor in the United States 100 years ago. The economy has grown, and because the economy has grown, the living standards have grown. And the notion of what it means to be poor is not as dire as it used to be. Okay, that wraps up largely our discussion of chapter 6 here. There's a little bit more of a discussion of money that's in chapter 6, but we actually can pick up a great deal of that in our next economist, David Ricardo, which we'll deal with here in chapter 7.